All right, welcome back, everybody. Going to take a look at Unit 8, Islam and the Rise of the Islamic Caliphate. Um, Now, you'll probably hear me say this in class about 100 times, but this is the pivotal event in period three. The creation, the diffusion, and the expansion of Islam has larger and longer lasting effects than any other event in period three. You can make an argument, at least in the short term of period three, that the Mongols, which we're going to get to in about 3 or 4 chapters, have a more immediate impact. You could say in the long run that the revival of Europe um, and the Renaissance and Europe's re-entry into kind of Eurasian interaction has a maybe a longer lasting effect, but at the end of the day, Islam is the second biggest religion in the world, roughly about 1.5 billion followers. Its cultural influence, its social influence, its political impact on the world is monumental. Um, so, by all means, this is going to be a unit that we really put some time and some effort into. Now, in terms of the recommended supplemental viewing, I put together a couple of choices for you. There is boatloads of information out there about Islam. I would be very careful what you look at and where you look at it from. With the political climate worldwide, especially in this country, with serious Islamophobia running kind of rampant in the Western world, there's a lot of BS out there. And a lot of the stuff that you're going to see online, and if you go looking for yourself, needs to be taken with a really large grain of salt. Um, Opposed to that, obviously, always recommend Crash Course. Pretty balanced, pretty fair viewpoint, in my opinion. The Khan Academy stuff is probably a little more detailed than you want, but it is what it is. The Islam 101 is another kind of quick snapshot to help reinforce what we're going to talk about. Now, with Islam, the beginnings of Islam and the teachings of Islam are incredibly important because more than any other faith, Islam defines itself by its beginnings and by its adherence to religious teachings and religious law. Okay. So it's important that we know the story of Islam and where this all comes from. So Islam is founded in the Arabian Peninsula around the year 600 CE by the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad comes from a merchant family in the city of Mecca. Now, to understand where Muhammad comes from and what the teachings of Islam uh, mean, you have to understand the situation in Arabia in the 7th century. Arabia at this point is a very politically far flung region. It has seen the coming and going of many a classical empire, but none of those classical empires have really been able to ever unite the Arabian Peninsula. Most of them don't want to. Um, it's not a particularly fertile area. Farming is not it is not an easy task in this area. So it doesn't really have a lot to offer the major empires of the day. It's for the most part ignored by the Romans. It's for the most part ignored by the Persians. And so in this area, you have dozens and dozens and dozens of different clans, which are then subdivided into tribes. Most of them are nomadic, usually merchants or pastoralists. It's very politically disunified. Um, However, the one thing that the Arabian Peninsula does very well is trade. And a lot of trade routes go in and out of Arabia. Specifically, its connections to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf make it a hub for camel caravans crossing the Arabian Desert. And of the cities in the Arabian Peninsula, Mecca is a hotspot for trade. It's closely located to the Red Sea. It's also at this point in time the spiritual home of Arabia. It is the home of the Kaaba, which is kind of it's a massive monument that begins out as a polytheistic monument. All of the different tribes and all the different clans within Arabia bring idols to the Kaaba, and it becomes a place of worship where they can seek the favor of their gods. It was also a constant pilgrimage site. So you had hundreds of thousands of people a year moving in and out of Mecca for trade purposes, for religious purposes. So, needless to say, the Arabs are pretty familiar with every major faith of the classical and post-classical era. Mecca is home to dozens, if not hundreds, of gods. And this does include the monotheistic religions. Zoroastrians make their home here, Jews, Christians, etc. So, in this environment, all right, you have Muhammad, who is from a merchant family, loses his parents very early in life, marries a wealthy older woman, becomes a merchant. He's part of the kind of dominant tribe in Mecca, which is the Quraysh, and he is doing relatively well for himself. And around the age of 40 years old, Muhammad begins to become upset, and he begins to become concerned by the level of greed and what he sees as corruption, not only in Mecca, but within his own tribe. And he begins to go to the hills around Mecca, and he begins to meditate. And during the process of his meditation, according to Islamic teachings, he is visited by the angel Gabriel. And the angel Gabriel speaks for the one true God. And the angel Gabriel, over the next 22 years, recites to Muhammad, and Muhammad memorizes the final revelations of the one true God. And so, over this period, as Muhammad is being given this revelation, he goes back and forth from the hills to Mecca. He's very reluctant. He's not quite sure if what he is being given is a message that he should be spreading. He is supported by his wife and his close friends, and he reluctantly begins spreading his revelations. And eventually, the teachings that he is attempting to spread come into conflict with the polytheism that is kind of rampant in Mecca. And Muhammad preaches against polytheism. He preaches, the destruction of idols, that, Allah is the one true God, that others should not be worshipped. And this really kind of makes him an outcast within his own tribe. They are angry that he is criticizing their profits. He's criticizing their wealth, their greed. He's criticizing their polytheism. And things start to get kind of hot for Muhammad in Mecca. And eventually he is chased slash banished from Mecca with about 30 of his followers. And he and those followers migrate north to the city of Yathrib, which is going to later become Medina. And this trip from Mecca to Medina is known as the Hijra. And this is considered the start point of the Islamic calendar. This is when the majority of Muslim teachings believe that Islam as a religion, as the one true religion, begins. Now, once Muhammad and his followers are in Yathrib slash Medina, his message really begins to find a home. Um, there are tribes of nomads that live around Medina known as Bedouins. There's a large Jewish community, a sizable Christian community who, are both familiar with the idea of the one true God. And Muhammad and his teachings begin to build up a pretty sizable following. And as we're going to talk about later down the road, Islam does not differentiate between secular and religious. Um, Religious teachings are secular teachings. Religious law is secular law. Islam, at its core, means submission to the will of Allah, and therefore, as the head of this Muslim community religiously, Muhammad is also the political leader of this community. And he essentially begins to take over as the political leader of Medina. And Muhammad proves to be a pretty good leader. He is a skillful general. He's a very adept politician. Shows himself to be an excellent governor, as well as being, the prophet of the one true God. So his authority and his power within and among his Islamic followers is basically unquestioned. And this is the beginning of the very first, like, true theocracy, where there is no differentiation between political and religious authority. All right. Yes, Muhammad is the political leader on earth, but the head of all is Allah. And Muhammad's teachings are not just simply spiritual on how to focus on the next life and the afterlife, but they also teach how to live in this life, and that all things are through the teachings of the one true God. So within a few years, this new Muslim state that's forming around the city of Medina becomes very powerful. And Muhammad begins to unite the different nomadic Arabic tribes around the area and builds a pretty sizable army. I believe the number is close to 10,000 when he decides to march back to Mecca. And Muhammad and his new Muslim army march to Mecca. The Meccans, for the most part, immediately surrender without or very little bloodshed. And at this point, with Medina and Mecca under his control, Muhammad has basically become the ruler of Arabia. And this creates a new Arabic Muslim theocratic state where God is recognized as the ruler of a state. There is no separation between church and state. Religious law equals secular law, right? If there is a dispute, it is handled by religious teachings. If there is if laws are created in order to govern, they are created based on the teachings of Islam, right? And this is actually a really important difference between Islam and the other monotheistic religions. In the case of all of the other monotheism that we've seen so far, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, and Christianity, each of those religions started out as a minor part of a much bigger society, of a much bigger empire. Um, Zoroastrianism in Persia was just one piece of the Persian culture. Judaism grows up under numerous empires: the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Egyptians, and therefore, again, they are subject to someone else's outside control and outside laws. Christianity, the same thing within the Roman Empire. Islam, however, does not have that distinction. In the beginning of Islam, Muhammad and his followers are their own state. So they get to mold and they get to make their state in whatever shape and form they see fit. They're not subject to the laws of some foreign power or some foreign ruler. And so this allows this early Arabian Islamic state to base its entire identity within the religion. Okay. And that is going to be a massively important thing going forward, because that is going to add an extra dimension to the way that Islam views itself, the way that the Islamic Empire views itself. It ties religion directly to political power, which is going to be a theme, going forward a little bit in this time period. So, no division between church and state. Secular equals religious. Religious equals secular. Now, in 632, 10 years after the Hijrah, Muhammad, depending upon what teachings you believe in, either dies or ascends directly into heaven. And he leaves behind a growing, powerful Arabic empire. Again, founded on and ruled by religious faith and teaching, completely defined by its faith, with this symbiotic relationship between the religion and the state. And that's going to be a very important piece of Islam's identity going forward, right? So by the time of Muhammad's death / ascension, this is essentially what you're looking at in the Middle East, North Africa, Europe. You have two large, very powerful, but secular states. You have the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine, which we'll get to in about 2 chapters. And you'll also see that you have the Sassanid Empire. This is another iteration of the Persians. So, two large, two very powerful, two very secular empires who essentially are kind of locked in this long-term, battle for control. And what happens is that, to their own demise, both of them, for the most part, ignore this growing Muslim empire in Arabia. They see Islam as just another religion in the pantheon, another prophet, and another faith to contend with. But they don't look at the empire itself as a real threat, which is going to come back and bite them